Okay, so this is my reading and commentary on chapter 20. Now at this point, of course, I've done 20 chapters, and I believe that there's about 11 more to go. The experience thus far has been illuminating, and at times it has been fatiguing, much like a long hike, but ultimately rewarding. So, as usual, I'll begin by reading the entirety of the chapter, and then I will subsequently read the verse and interpret the way I see the verse. And this will be spread over a number of parts. So let's begin. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. The fear of the king is as a roaring of a lion. Whoso provoketh him to anger sinneth against his own soul. It is an honor for a man to cease from strife, but every fool will be meddling. The sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold. Therefore shall he beg in harvest, and have nothing. The counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Most men will proclaim every one his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find? The just man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. A king that sins in the throne of judgment scattereth away all evil with his eyes. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure of my sin? Divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Even a child is known by his doings, whether his work be pure and whether it be right. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made even both of them. Love not sleep, lest you come to poverty. Open your eyes, and you shall be satisfied with bread. It is not, says the buyer. But when he is gone his way, then he boasteth. There is gold, and a multitude of rubies, but the lips of knowledge are a precious jewel. Take his garment that is surety for a stranger, and take a pledge of him for a strange woman. Bread of deceit is sweet to a man, but afterwards his mouth shall be filled with gravel. Every purpose is established by counsel, and with good advice make war. He that goes about as a tale-bearer revealeth secrets. Therefore meddle not with him that flattereth with his lips. Whoso curseth his father or his mother, his lamp shall be put out in obscure darkness. An inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning, but the end thereof shall not be blessed. Say not you, I will recompense evil, but wait on the Lord, and he shall save you. Divers weights are an abomination unto the Lord, and a false balance is not good. Man's goings are of the Lord, but how can a man then understand his own way? It is a snare to a man who devoureth that which is holy, and after vows to make enquiry. A wise king scattereth the wicked, and bringeth the wheel over them. The spirit of man is the candle of the Lord, searching all the inward parts of the belly. Mercy and truth preserve the king, and his throne is upheld by mercy. The glory of young men is their strength, and the beauty of old men is the gray head. The blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil, so do stripes the inward parts of the belly. So that concludes chapter 20. In all we have 30 verses. So let's begin with verse 1. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Now on the surface this is straightforward, but at this point it is quite clear that we are not after superficial or surface level distinctions or interpretations. We are concerned with the fundament. And having said that, I think in the first instance of this verse, it is certainly advising us against excessive use of alcohol, of being imprudent when we approach things that alter our mind. But what could be said specifically of that first part? Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging. So let's begin with mocker. What does it mean to mock somebody? So to mock is to tease or laugh at in a scornful way or a contemptuous manner. It is to make something seem laughably unreal or impossible. It is to mimic someone or something scornfully or contemptuously. It can be an object of derision. These are the many definitions of this word, mock. Now, a scorner is a word that comes up often in the Proverbs. Along with scorn, we have this an accompanying word that is often used in the definition, that of contempt. When we scorn somebody, somebody is seen as beneath, despicable, worthy of contempt. The word contempt means the feeling that a person or thing is beneath consideration, that they are worthless. So, we imagine this wine possessing some ability. It possesses the ability to mock. That is, the relationship that we ultimately form with this substance, especially in large amounts, is contemptuous. It is contemptuous in the sense that something is happening within the mind that one is looking down on, either themselves or the people outside of themselves, external to themselves. There is something about the loosening of the restraints, the lack of the inhibition that accompanies that drunken state or inebriated state, that causes this beneath or worthlessness. Now, of course, something that is worthless, especially in the human context, is something that we can, based on the degree, can consider evil, wicked, or foolish. Now, upon consideration, when the language is used in such a manner as to say wine is a mocker, I think of a wine bottle. Of course, that is full. I attribute to it this agency. Again, it has this capacity to mock. Now, what I hear here is that from this illustration, from this narrative, as the wine has this sort of consciousness of itself, it is sort of a reflection the verse at least is prompting us to see the reflection as if the wine had its own perception and ability to speak from a person that is unable to limit themselves or has a difficulty with addiction, and uses the wine, that mind-altering substance, in such a way that it degrades them. It degrades their experience, it dulls the mind, it creates a general lack of awareness and attentiveness. In this way, as our attention views wine in that sense, wine surely has is in the position of looking down, even as an object. It's interesting that we are prompted to reflect in this manner, that an object is looking down upon us. And in terms of the value hierarchy, I think it's quite easy to appreciate, in a sense, that an object, now it's not just any old object, it's not just a material thing that has not been touched by human ingenuity. This is something that has been shaped, has been formed. There's a degree of attention that has been placed into making this product. And yet it's still an object. It is an object to be used, it is an object to be consumed. And so while it may be above that of the meaningless landscape, perhaps the barren landscape of the earth that does not have that human touch or the touch of life, it's completely inanimate. The wine being above this state is well beneath that of the value that man has, in the sense that man is the one that brings light to that which is otherwise unseen. The rock cannot see itself, it cannot appreciate itself, it has no self. It is an identity because of the attention that the conscious being brings to it. And from this, we can appreciate that the wine, again, having no true agency in and of itself, although its form has been modified above that base material circumstance. It has now moved in a position that is able to look down on. It is able to perceive of the human being and his weakness towards its contents as something that is beneath it. Now, of course, the person is only beneath the wine. Now, I want to say in a relative sense, but I feel a certain way about saying relative, but contextually, perhaps we can say that this is true, or in a tongue-in-cheek manner, we can say this is true, but of a man that is so reduced that he is beneath the value of the material product of wine is quite the user of alcohol. This is a person that completely obliterates their attentive capacity. They themselves mock their own inner ability, capacity, gift. There are, now I think of the countless police videos that are on YouTube of DUI encounters where they have to go through testing people, and there are certainly a lot of videos that involve unfortunate circumstances in which drunk individuals slam into other vehicles or pedestrians. But as a matter of reflection, there's one video in particular I'm thinking about in which a man that was drunk, he ran into a bunch of cars that were stopped. Apparently somebody had been pulled over, and he slammed into that sort of those people that were outside of the car, the officer that was there. He killed a couple of the people. The officer was okay. And ironically, the man that was completely out of his mind, drunk, was relatively unharmed. Now, in this way, we see a form of wickedness. We see something of a reduced agent. We see something of a light that is flickering, that it has capacity to see, to understand, to perceive, but it increasingly becomes not its own. It becomes a slave to that mockery. It becomes deserving of that mockery, perhaps. And in the sense that has happened, that this accident has happened, the wine stands above the man who had killed these people because of his poor ability to control himself. Understand why the restraints are in place. The self-restraint. I think in a broader sense, the self-restraint is quite a profound topic of discussion, of which many of the verses in the Proverbs thus far have touched on. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging. Now, when I think of the word raging, I think of, in the first instance, I think of a river or a rapid. That is something that has a lot of force behind it. It is, in some sense, out of control. If one were to find themselves in a raging river, it would take them, it would submit them to the force of that river, to that rage. In a like manner, I think of the word hemorrhage. By extension, I think of an aortic hemorrhage or a cerebral hemorrhage in which the wall of a vessel is broken and the blood is just bursting out of that vessel. And again, due to the removal of the restraint in the arterial sense, the integrity of the wall has been demolished. Now, what rages forth, it is beyond the control of the individual to stop it. And it is very likely that the individual will die because of that response, because of the lack of restraint that is otherwise necessary to keep the integrity of that structure, to continue a certain type of experience. Again, that levels all the way up. If there's an aortic aneurysm, or aortic hemorrhage, this is a pretty severe event, which is likely to result in death. And if it were, of course this is a bodily example, this is not necessarily of mind or of self, but it certainly applies. I think it's analogous to it. Again, the restraints are necessary to maintain the continuity of the system. And so if we apply the raging river to the hemorrhage, to that of strong drink, it is no different. The strong drink removes the restraints. In some sense, in the case of the river, the restraint has to do with control over their physical movement. And because they have entered into the river, the restraints have been removed. Now they are subject to that force. In the case of the drink, what rages forth perhaps is a state of inebriation. And that state of inebriation has submitted the self to its will. And so therefore we see the mockery of the wine, and we see the river that becomes of the strong drink, that raging river that submits the self. to it. And whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Surely there is a lack of prudence. There is a lack of temperance, lack of restraint. And so at the outset, I had considered this to be an anti-drinking verse, let's say, sort of in informal language. But I think it's a little bit more subtle than that. It's a reflection on self-control. And I think this can go beyond just wine. We can place many things here. Many things for which, if we do not exercise proper restraint, they can become strong and raging. The fear of a king is as the roaring of a lion. Whoso provoketh him to anger sinneth against his own soul. So to begin, we have to understand the position of the king, that he stands above all else in terms of the hierarchy of society. He has the power, he has the authority, he has the control. Now I should say that the king here in this verse is lowercase k, so this is not referring to God. Now the fear of the king is as the roaring of a lion. This seems to suggest a certain type of relationship, that the lion and the king represent this place in the hierarchy of a hunter, of a tyrant perhaps, of something that is something that can be observed, not necessarily something that will attack, but as something that is provoked, certainly will do harm to the person that provokes it. And since the lion is such a powerful animal, the fear is self-explanatory. The lion will easily overpower the man. Whoso provoke him to anger sins against his own soul. Now here is when we come to more of a meaningful description. We must ask ourselves, well, why exactly, if one provokes the king to anger, do they sin against his own soul? Now it's easy enough to understand why provoking the king to anger would be a bad thing. For one, to anger the king, just as to anger the lion, it causes us to risk our lives. But it's not necessarily the life that is emphasized here, it is the soul. And there is a transgression, there is a sin against that soul. The soul being the seat of being, the thing that ties an individual to his existence. In some sense, it is involved, it is the mechanism that is involved in his relatedness to the world and to God. It is a multidimensional structure, perhaps. And to sin against such a structure, it is to cross a certain boundary. A boundary that offends the soul. It is something that perhaps disrupts that relationship between the world or between God. Now certainly death would be something that disrupts that, but that doesn't seem like it's the end of the interpretation. I think there is something more at work here. I think there is something that is involved at the structure of that hierarchy. I think there is an accurate interpretation involving the dangers of going against the king when he has the power to destroy the individual, but in a more sophisticated sense. As we imagine the hierarchy of consciousness, perhaps, we could think of this as a capital K king as well, where this doesn't have to be something that in our modern context is quite difficult to understand, since we are over 200 years into a society in which we have fought a revolution to disband and to disrupt the institution of hereditary succession and that of the monarchical institution. But as a matter of levels of consciousness, in the way that we see here, we can think about it in two ways. We can think about the role of the king that sits in a deserved place, and we can think about the role of a king in the sense of a tyrant, in which he has found himself and placed himself there arbitrarily, and perhaps is not necessarily deserving of his status. Now, in the second instance, I think it's probably sufficient to use that initial interpretation, just as one does not provoke a lion so that they are not harmed because of the power of the lion. One does not provoke the tyrant in a similar manner. But of the former, of the king that must be a king by virtue of man and his society requiring that role to be filled, that is, that leadership position and that central direction, the deciding factor, the executive. That role is there for a reason, and no matter how we design our societies, there will be an executive position. Whether we think of the mother and the father that encompass executive positions in the family, or of a corporate executive, or that of a president that literally holds an executive office. What we are concerned with here is the natural consequence of the provocation of the natural executive position of man. That is, of his natural organization and orientation, that structure of society. What would it mean for somebody that is lower on that scale to provoke that in the higher? Now, it could be, we can interpret this in two farther ways. One could be that the higher level is indeed higher in terms of consciousness, which we can explore the God category, or in terms of comparedness among human beings, that the person that is higher may be considered higher because of their ability, because of their cognitive capacity, whatever, or diligence in life, whatever it might be, to get themselves in a deserved place of leadership, versus somebody else that is not in that position, that is beneath to a certain extent. And the degree to which we can say above or beneath depends on many different factors. Now, of the beneath provoking the above, what can we say? Well, based on the verse, we say that if that provocation leads to anger, there is a sin against one's own soul. Now here, I think there is difficulty, especially in the case of examining human institutions, because it is very difficult to, unlike the king who holds is more of an obvious category than much of the categories of the free society, in which the individual and his control it's quite more profound than that in the ancient world. But in terms of in the case of God, if we are to provoke to anger that which is, we will find ourselves in a situation for which certainly we will be judged. We will be judged according to the way that things are, and not necessarily to the way that we want things to be. And now this is going to come down through the chain of being, the chain of perception, the chain of connectedness, the chain that links together our sense of belonging and purpose. The transgression necessarily disrupts that chain of communication. And that disruption will lead to an insecurity of being, and in extreme cases, the risk is quite high for the cessation of the perceptual experience, as in the case of the first instance, with that of the lion. So if we are to bring this all together, or if we are to expand further, what can be said here? The saying, as so above and so below. I think of, again, the fractal representation of reality, that of the Russian doll that I've talked so much about, that of the experience of something that is small in form and is repeated throughout to larger and larger scales, from the microcosm to the macrocosm, from the macrocosm to the microcosm. This is fractal. Insofar as there is this hierarchy, the hierarchy seems so superficial when I consider man's societal structure as to that of his relationship to the divinity. But all the same, even despite his failures and his wickedness, his institutions will find this layering of responsibility. And whether a man provokes the leadership of the town, of the head of the family, or of the president, or that of God, there will be consequences throughout that chain. And because of the disruption, the shaking of the chain, again, the sense of being, the sense of connectedness will also be disturbed. Now, in the case of the human institution, sometimes, we find ourselves in muddy territory. Things are not known in an absolute sense from the condition of man, so there is often this shaking of the chain in society. Revolutions occur, times change, people's understanding changes. There are periods of stability and safety and security, but also periods of profound disruption, insecurity. And so I think, conclusively, for this verse, what we should walk away with is that representation of reality, that vertical representation of the varying degrees of responsibility that man holds within his own sphere of experience. That includes the collective. And we can go again fractally all the way down to the individual, as all the way above to the top. That provocation by the individual to any point in that chain, we must understand, although we might not understand exactly how it will manifest, we should understand, just as we look at an electrical problem, perhaps, where you have a continuity of wire that goes from some central point to some peripheral point. If there is a disruption somewhere in there, of course, we understand that everything distal to that is going to lose the capacity to be turned on or to have electrical input. Now, in the case of society, I think this means a lack of stability rather than a lack of life, right? I mean, in the electrical example, it's easy to compare that of the light that illuminates from a light bulb as something that is analogous to consciousness and of experience, which is a useful analogy in and of itself, but that's not the analogy that I'm using here. The primary takeaway is that of the disruption. Another example would be a peripheral nerve injury in the human body. That there is some damage to a nerve, and distal to that nerve, perhaps the motor function and sensory perception is diminished or absent. And in this way, a provocation would be initiated at the site of the lesion. And again, the consequences are distal to that. It is an honor for a man to cease from strife, but every fool will be meddling. So where to start with this verse? Perhaps we should start with honor. So of honor, what can we say? I think of honor I think of respect, esteem, glory, praise to a certain degree, acclaim. But of respect, the definition that I see in front of me here, a feeling of deep admiration for someone or something elicited by their abilities, qualities, or achievements. So by one's actions, by one's behaviors, perhaps we can say by one's being, that would be kind of a stretch, but certainly by one's behaviors, for which somebody else can experience and interpret. Of course, one's behaviors, actions stem from that core of being. And in the cases of deep bonded relationships, an individual that is outside of our man of concern surely would recognize some of these fundamental qualities. Perhaps they would recognize the inner being of that person. And of respect, what can we say? I think I was considering this and thinking that respect, honor, esteem, all of this sort of stuff has such an implicit understanding in our culture that when I go to think about it, even when I read the definitions, I have a hard time grasping exactly it is what these terms mean. But what I'm interested in here is boiling these words down such that it involves not necessarily a better definition, but more so of how this relates to our experience. What I'm interested in is binding it to the relational. So what do I mean from that? Let's take respect as a part of this honor. As a result, somebody does something honorable. They have made some sacrifice, perhaps, that is observed by somebody else. And this person that has done the observing now honors the person that has done this behavior, that has made this sacrifice. Perhaps it was an act of selflessness that this person found admirable. What is it within this relationship between the observer and the actor that establishes the word, that establishes the meaning, that gives honor some identity? Well, in the first instance, obviously, it involves a moral decision. Something was done, in this case a sacrifice was done, an act of selflessness was done, such that, for whatever reason, whether it be a natural instinct of the heart or some reasonable pattern that the observer has plucked out of that experience, that they find useful, that they can integrate into their own experience, or a pattern that they find satisfying, that it is agreeable, it is symmetrical, it is beautiful, perhaps. Beauty is one of these things that's difficult to define, but once one experiences it, they know it. To a degree, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, although I think that we can say certain concrete things about beauty that are universal. Okay, so the person, the observer, so we have the behavior, so we have that moral action, we have the action of selflessness. So let's spend a second or so here discussing why this might be valuable, why this might be the initial piece for the development and establishment of that relation, such that honor is born of it. Now, of course, the relationship that I'm talking about here is between two people, two human beings. I think we can go in the vertical axis between the divinity, but we need not get there at this point. So of an act of selflessness, we see here a sacrifice. We have a trade, or perhaps a trade is not right. We have the giving without the expectation of receiving. And I can go a step further and say that it is beyond the expectation of receiving. It can be the denial of any remuneration or any reconciliation for the sacrifice. And let's say that it's high stakes. Let's say the sacrifice was painful to the individual. The sacrifice was lofty. In the warrior context, perhaps somebody had taken an arrow or a bullet for one of their compatriots. The sacrifice that they underwent was potential harm, surely harm, potential death. And the act of selflessness preserved the life of the individual that they had stood in front of, let's say. Now, this is a cliche example. No doubt there are many acts of selflessness that can occur on a more typical basis, that is more congruent and experientially relevant to the majority of people. Perhaps it's something simple, like the act of opening a door for somebody. It says, "You may go first. I, in this situation, am not more important than you." And that little nod at somebody else's individuality and the identification of their worth, I think, is an interesting little positive cultural expression that is honorable, I think. It's respectful. Now, I'll have to admit, what I wanted to try and do was find the value of performing a selfless act, barring the relational component, that of the relational act in and of itself. And I asked myself, where is the good in the absence of the relational? I open the door for somebody else. I deny the other person for a moment, just for a split second. So I have made a decision. But within the decision involves that relation. It involves the acknowledgement of somebody else and the establishment of some connection. It also involves the decision to put one's own needs separate for a moment, for something else, for something outside of that self. Now, is it possible to sacrifice the self in the absence of the relational? Let's say there's nobody there. Of course, the example is going to change because I'm not going to open the door for the breeze. And so let's say I am alone. Of course, I can make my sacrifices to God. But the question is, would any act of selflessness, in the absence of the relationship between the horizontal, in this case that is the relationship between human beings, and the vertical would be that of that which is above him, which is the divinity, should be God. Is it the case, and is it necessary, that a sacrifice must be placed somewhere if it is outside of the self? And I think the answer is yes. It seems like it's an obvious yes. But let's see here. If it's placed outside of the self, does it have to be either the horizontal to the human being or above to a divinity? To this, I'm not entirely sure. I suppose there is an element of me that wants to say you can sacrifice to whatever you want to sacrifice to. I suppose within that wanting there is a degree of selfishness, because surely I can open a door for somebody for my own gain. I can try and establish a relationship with somebody for selfish purposes and try to get in their good graces by doing little things just to get into the door, right? Or, in the case of the lonesomeness, the condition where I find myself alone. For some reason I'm thinking of myself out in the wilderness somewhere. But to satisfy my mind at wanting to use this illustration, I'll accept and say, okay, I'm no longer opening the door for anybody. I'm not opening the door for the breeze. I'm not in the parking lot of the building that I was considering. I'm in the wilderness. And I'm alone. And I found myself exhausted at the day-to-day of satisfying my own needs. I find myself living in a world that is vast. Its vastness is well beyond me, and yet my day-to-day is consumed by me. My own internal world. That everything outside of me is just there for me to satisfy myself. The irony here would be, because of my own selfishness, I would want to be more selfless and to appreciate the world outside of me. That in and of itself stems from the self. It is a desire of the self that wishes to be satisfied. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is some difference, and that there is a genuineness in the pursuit of forgetting about the self and the selfish experience in order to be more connected to the outside, to that which is not myself. But in order to do that, I must establish a relationship with something else, because I cannot abandon myself completely. I can limit my own selfish view of the world, but I, as an individual and as an agent, will always be something. There will always be decisions that need to be made for the maintenance of the self. Otherwise, the self would perish, which I don't think is a just behavior. And I don't think it's a just behavior because if the abandonment and at the end of what complete selflessness is the destruction of the self, then what we are considering is the darkening of that perceptual sphere, such that intelligibility should not be experienced by the human being in general, and that of other conscious beings, if they have some identifiable self, that they ought not to as well experience in such a way that they have a self. And if everything that had some self-conception were to completely blot themselves out, there would be nothing left. It would be complete nothingness. There would be no darkness, for there would be no light. There would be no light, for there would be no darkness. There would just be nothing. Not even the concept of nothing. And for that to occur, it doesn't make sense. There's nothing about nothing that is intelligible. For even the concept of nothing requires a mind. Even the concept of darkness requires a mind to see and to appreciate it. Now I'll have to say, in this moment, I feel a bit of a somatic response. My body feels warm to the touch. For some reason I have this, there is no anxiety, there's a calmness, but there is a clamminess to my skin. That is something usually I experience in states of anxiety, and yet I feel none. My heart is calm. There is a sense of excitement, as though I feel a hand on my shoulder. Something that is thanking me, that is filling me with a certain love. And I have a difficulty understanding exactly what this is. Now I could say that it is God, and surely it must be to some degree. But exactly why this experience is happening now, because of a relatively simple conscious experiment, certainly this response could be a reflection of my own ego and excitement. But it can also be the understanding of the relationship that I have to the world and of the care of that which has set this in motion, that has made it possible for the existence of things. For even if certain things are not in and of themselves conscious, they are intelligible. And for this I feel a sense of love and connectedness. And I'm grateful for that. But I would not also want to be too distracted here from this exploration. And so if there is at all some connection, some highway that has been, or some anastomosis that has been created between my mind and some paralleled experience, I would ask it to stay with me as I continue. And so I find myself here in the woods, perhaps on a prairie, sitting Indian style, coming to this understanding that I must be in relationship to something. That myself will always exist, and there will be a degree of selfishness in all of my actions. But there must be discernment by saying that selfishness, there may be a positive element and a negative element. There's a degree of profound selfishness that may be composed of such a restriction in view, inability to see outside, that necessarily the self becomes the prison of delusion, the prison for which the mind is unable to see the true relationship. It's unable to see the relationship of itself relative to that which it is a part of and that which had brought it into being. So thus far I've determined that in order to sacrifice, in order to be selfless, it necessarily involves a relationship. That doesn't have to involve a relationship between an individual. It doesn't have to involve a relationship between the individual and a centralized deity. But here's the difficulty. The relationship can be between any number of things. The theos can be found everywhere. And when I say that the divinity doesn't need to be a centralized thing is because within the mind of man, I think in his or her ability to establish some relationship by which he forms some conceptual paradigm around this thing. Perhaps he has a relationship with a rock, just to put out something kind of simple and a bit preposterous. Or he can have a relationship to a living thing, like a tree, or an animal, a sophisticated animal like a dog, or a monkey. But any number of things, if he is going to deify something, I think the degree to which he deifies that which is less than some centralized, all-encompassing deity, for which everything that the mind is able to perceive, everything that is intelligible in general, has come from. He is perceiving and he is establishing relationships with things that are well beneath that ultimate theos. Now, that's not to say that it can't happen. Of course it can. And of course, the relationship between him and those like him to another human being affords him certain opportunities to the opportunity lies within, if we are to take the analogy, or the example that I started with, which is the man that had performed some sacrifice in the line of duty, or who had performed some selfish behavior as a part of a normal cultural custom. The opportunity there is for he and the other person to connect. And what does it mean to connect? Well, we can consider this to be a recognition of worth by one mind to another. Let's remember the verse here. It is an honor for a man to cease from strife. We haven't even gotten to cease from strife yet. We're still on honor. But within this recognition, the direction of attention by establishing some relation between two conscious entities, or some relationship or relation full stop between the conscious entity and the other thing. Whether it be the supreme divinity or some divine inkling that they have found, that they have observed within nature, and have yet to connect the pieces all the way to the top. That relation involves, again, selflessness, respect, and the appreciation of value that comes with the true sacrifice. But what does that mean? Well, herein lies, I think, another interesting conception. Because within the idea of worth, if we are going to restrict that to the selfish conception of what is worthwhile, he may find himself in a delusional sphere, maybe attributing value or false worth to something. He may, because he feels rightly, attribute worth to something when it is in actuality worthless. He may not feel as though something is worthwhile or something that is worth doing. And I think In the case of the selfless sacrifice, often this is the case. But if there is some principle I can say in the beginning here, on this new path of exploration, it is that the feelings are not necessarily required in order for worth to be attributed. It is something that is independent of what man feels. But it is of a prudent man, I think, to establish his heart in such a way, to temper his heart in such a way, that he is afforded the proper feelings when they are due. So from all of this, I think it necessarily means that there is a third relationship that is established. That is, there is some judiciary that sits above the established relationship, unless the relationship is with the judiciary in and of itself. And what is the role of that judiciary? Well, the role of that judiciary is to decide whether the thing that has been done is a worthy sacrifice or is a true selfless sacrifice. And as we've already discussed, that word selfless has issues with it. But to the degree, I think, that we understand that some sacrifices, well, even here it's difficult, because in the case of the military virtue, military honor and self-sacrifice, this is probably something that the heart feels quite strongly. It's an instinct of the heart to preserve one's compatriot. On the other hand, there are many self-sacrifices that are antagonistic to feelings, which again goes back to my principle about the inconsistency of the heart and of the prudent man tempering the heart. So, the judiciary, because of the nature of man and the difficulty for finding that which is actually true, independent of his desires and of his heart, there must be some standard outside of him that establishes that relation for which his conduct can make any sense. And it's within this referee that established the laws of all things, of nature and of relation, that he is, perhaps in the first instance, propositioning when he decides to make this act of selflessness. And I think of, in this example, the opening the door for somebody, because it's simple, it's quick, it's easy, something implicit that we all do, most of us do. I don't do enough. Here, I think, the appeal must be made to that divinity. The conception, now it is undoubtedly a conception of the mind, because it depends on what the mind has attributed to be suprahuman, to be above man. It could be just the divinity that he finds in nature, perhaps, or it could be that supreme divinity. Perhaps he has found himself in that position of the one that created all. Now, I think if he wants himself to appear selfless and not selfish, perhaps he will do this sacrifice and not understand exactly why he is performing the behavior. And perhaps it's good enough. Perhaps it brings him good things in life. Now, it may be indistinguishable from the narcissist, who again does these things, seemingly sacrificial acts to get into one's good graces for their own purposes, which of course is the antagonism of that directed goal of selflessness. And so truth, to a certain degree, relies on what is known from within an individual. Now, of course, this is dependent upon this particular context, and that the will of man, I think, can be seen strong here. Now, the last thing I would like to say about honor before we move on, again, the first part of this verse, it is an honor for a man to cease from strife. The last thing that I would like to say here about this honor is the symbol that emerges. We have 3 points here. Where do we find the 3 points? In the Catholic Church, we have the Trinity, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Yet now we have a relationship between God, man, and something that is outside of him. Perhaps we can say the spirit of man. The spirit of man that is perceivable by us from the being of another man, right? Because we are thinking about an analogy between two people and God as the judiciary at the top. It doesn't necessarily have to map over completely with the Divine Trinity. It's just an interesting parallel that there is this symbol that seems to be put forth here. A symbol, again, that we have seen in terms of the relationship of the mountain. The mountain is a triangular shape, wide base, narrow peak. It is an honor for a man to cease from strife. Now, of all that we have said about honor, why is it the case that it is so for a man, it is honorable for a man to cease from strife? So the word strife has a combative connotation. This definition is angry or bitter disagreement over fundamental issues, conflict. Now immediately I see the antagonism between that of strife and that of the conditions that must be in place for honor to take hold. Again, honor, as I have come to determine, is bound up in that relation. It's bound up within the relational sphere. And from this relationship, no matter how simple an honorable person, an experience that produces respect from somebody, is an experience or a way of being that reflects goodness. Goodness, something that is continually drawing into itself, that's continually expressing itself as it is, that is at peace with itself. You know, given the vast changes that I have gone through in my mind, in my life, perhaps I could say relative to others, the changes have not been that drastic, but within my mind, certainly, my thoughts take me from here to there. And moreover from that, examining the world outside of myself, there has been profound change over the many years, but also of recent years. And there will continue to be rapid change for the years to come. And I say that because when I consider goodness, when I consider transcendence, I don't necessarily think of perpetual peace. I think of goodness as something that is conditional. Perhaps that is a condition that is specific to man because of his state of not knowing. But if man had known everything, and he had found himself in complete security, I wonder what his state would be. There's a certain level of utopianism that is just hard to imagine that it is possible. Almost as if goodness is to persist, and if beauty is to persist, there must be some underlying difficulty that is taken, some burden that is placed upon the shoulders. And the burden doesn't necessarily have to be inherently wicked, perhaps, we could say. It's not something that inherently has to be damaging, but rather a burden in a positive sense. Just like one puts on their running shoes to go out for a run, they challenge themselves. It's difficult, it could be painful. The mind would like to do anything but that experience. And yet once the body and the mind are in communion, and there is a sufficient push into the intensity, overcoming barriers, and then the process of winding down, and after the experience, the reflective experience afterwards that is afforded by the accomplishment of some task. In some sense, we ourselves find within our own action and transcendence, in the sense that we have done something that was difficult, that we had to sacrifice to do. We have gained a certain level of respect for ourselves. And that burden that we decided to take on our shoulders was a type of leisure. This was nothing of the case of a man in the state of destitution that's required to make a long march. No, this is something different entirely. And so perhaps I've gotten myself into the weeds here. But as a matter of reflection on the good, I think it's not as simple of a matter as to view a painting and then to be just sort of overcome by it, or to be put at ease by it. The sensation of being put to ease, I think, can be positive, perhaps it can be negative in excess, but it is but a piece of that experience in which the human being experiences goodness. And so in that context, when I say that goodness is reflected by the honorable, it's perhaps not as glorifying and as euphoric, perhaps, as it may sound. Because goodness appears to us, it comes to us in all sorts of different ways. And it's not until we have gone through certain struggles, sometimes significant struggle, in order to accept that which is actually true, at which time we actually appreciate what was actually good about the thing that we were struggling, perhaps against or for. But strife on the other hand, again, angry or bitter disagreement over fundamental issues, conflict. This friction seems, the word strife, it seems to be this continual opposition, almost like a magnet that repels another. There is just something about it which consistently and perpetually finds itself limited to that of the disarticulation. And I think that part of the reason that I went on that rabbit hole about goodness is that there is something to be said about strife in a similar manner. Not that strife is a good thing, but, and I think this is a big but, it depends on perhaps a particular type of experience. But strife, I think, can be seen by some as a path to the good. That conflict and that friction, that passionate disagreement over the fundament. Certainly something we see a lot today in politics. Well, it's not just politics, we see it everywhere, really. And I think that there is a mistake that at some point a person, perhaps wanting to do good, ends up just disagreeing to disagree, being an absolute contrarian. And I think that this is one potential path. There's another path of the nature of strife, and that is sort of a response to conflict and friction that is entirely inappropriate if one is to view the broader picture of how conflict and how the questioning of fundamental issues and the just general growth of the human spirit can be placed within the path, the trajectory, the staircase up to goodness. And strife is an unfortunate pit. Again, the pit of Sheol from the Psalms comes to mind. That it is, as I've said, a misinterpretation of the path, of the way. It can, at the same instance, be something in which somebody gives in to their base desires, to their most immediate reaction. There are times when I am seemingly irritable for no reason, and that bizarre state of being translates to my interpersonal relations. And sometimes, depending, of course this doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it takes some effort to break out of it. Again, like the analogy of the runner, there has to be a burden that's taken on, in the positive sense. Understanding that this irritability is a hurdle that needs to be surmounted, because if it is not, then it remains in that strife-ridden state. And perhaps herein lies the key in this example. Because in the state in which we do not recognize our own failures, I think is the degree to which we fail to be honorable, not only to ourselves but also to God, to that center point. And the degree to which we do recognize our partiality and our, on one hand we can call irritability that is not attached to any particular experience irrational. By extension, perhaps I should add that it's not just experience, but it's, again, relational. If it's not attached to any relation, if it's just sort of existing, just sort of this burning antagonism for no reason. Certainly something such as that can be considered irrational. But also, I think more importantly, and perhaps I just said this and I'm about to say it again, but it is something that it exists alone. And it doesn't exist despite what the feeling is or what the conflict is. I think the same could be said of the expression blissful ignorance. It's an existence and a feeling that is detached from any sort of relation, that it is relative only to itself. It is an axis around which itself spins. I would say it's not self-sustaining. It's something that has been brought into existence, but has sort of sputtered out. It has blown a circuit. It's just sort of there, vibrating. But when it's attached to something, then instead of this vibration, it has purpose, it has movement, it has direction. And so within that strange illustration, I would say that strife is this sort of independence, or we could say selfishness, we could say auto-orientation or auto-axial, such that there is nothing good that can come of it, because it is not connected to anything. It cannot be honorable, because it is not in communion with that which is that can bestow honor. It is not in relation to anything but itself. It is an honor for a man to cease from strife, but every fool will be meddling. And now when I was with reading that and going through some of the explanation, I was thinking also of an experience that I had which was not quite strife, but it's another perhaps experience that can be extracted from the progression of that experience of strife, that sort of individual, nonsensical irritability, or perhaps more accurately, according to this new situation that I'm about to present, it was more of a dullness, like one had, like I had just woken up from a slumber, which indeed, I mean, part of that is the case. I had a work obligation, 7 a.m, to last 2 hours, 2-hour meeting. Some of it is, there's a participatory element in it, but my mind was in such a place, perhaps because of the closeness to my waking, but that, of course, is an excuse. Also, perhaps the environment, which is not all that communicative, which is, again, not an excuse. But all of this, my behavior, is isolated. And it is isolated such that there is no communion, there is no relation, and it causes a stagnation of experience. There's no goodness to be had or to be found, because there's no goodness that is being searched for, or that is being discovered. And I had in my mind a possible experience, sort of like a play that was unfolding in my mind, in which I was trying to rationalize to the head of this meeting why myself, for my part, do not participate in such a way that would lead us to this goodness. And the part that I would play as this actor almost immediately became the fool. The immediate reaction is humor. It is something to downplay, and yet immediately go down to the depths, into which, using sort of a foolish, silly type of light, fluffy-esque demeanor, perhaps an ironic demeanor, to try and explain away, to justify, maybe not justify, but to explain away my auto-axial experience. and why I am unable, that I do not participate in such a way as to find the axis around which we can all commune, which is of course superhuman, and spin that wheel such that we all catch it and we all revolve. Now, of the second part of this verse, I think there is a relation here. But every fool will be meddling. The fool, of course, is this person that is not all that serious if they find themselves in a state of strife or in a state of lonesomeness that is separate from everything, that they don't actively concern themselves with finding their way back home or the goodness. They're satisfied perhaps with just sitting down and doing nothing, or making light, not in the positive sense, making light in terms of the lessening the gravity of that which would bind us to something, like sort of constantly loosening the bolts around some sturdy object just to make it loose. It's a sort of silly behavior, a Joker-esque behavior. And this type of person that is active, this intrusive, unwarranted interference on the part of the fool, is one that threatens to destabilize any such situation by which people can come together and commune and to find that good. It's a disruption of the heart by, again, the distraction of attention, the pulling away, the removal into the insecure, the removal into the unfocused, inattentive. And so, of course, the second half of this verse here flows beautifully, because the fool that is meddling is the type that actively pursues strife or any such identity that finds itself alone and disconnected. This meddling is something that perhaps even of the whole wishes to carve out a piece and to see it on its way, sort of like a piece of ice that's cut off of a larger body of ice just to float away. And of course that is an analogy to attention. That this attention is this massive iceberg, and when a big piece of it is melted off, sheared off, this is sort of like the meddling fool that takes it away, that sets it out to sea, to sort of dilute and melt into the rest of that unintelligible sphere. The sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold, therefore shall he beg in harvest and have nothing. Now this is another one of these verses that seems relatively straightforward. It's simple enough. The man reaps what he sows. Of course, if this person is bothered by the cold, not much work gets done. And as such, his lack of prudence, his care for the future, will be felt at harvest time. But as a matter of reflection, of course, this is not just something that is restricted to the agricultural domain. The sluggard is this perennial figure. Surely it's a figure that finds its home in every single one of our hearts. And if we are honest about it, I think, at least when I'm honest about it, I'm surprised and somewhat horrified to the degree to which I let that sluggard find its home within me. That I have this tendency to find all the reasons in the world to remove myself from what actually should be done. I think often the reason that I give perhaps is not the cold, but it's more so that things are mentally taxing. At least what I know I ought to be doing, I also know will be something that drains me. And there is this pervasive fear of potentially being exposed to a burnout-like sensation. For I believe at some point in my history I have gone through such an experience, and it's difficult to go through psychologically. And at the same time, it's difficult to justify one's failure. That is to say, surely there are many people that go through worse, and yet are not affected the same way. Of course, comparing oneself to others presents all sorts of difficulties and incongruencies. But surely this fear of burnout, which leads to some degree of fear of exertion, the exertion in excess eventually finds itself a philosophy of comfort, that surely some things manage to get done, many things perhaps manage to get done, and yet there is this voice within, perhaps we can call him the anti-sluggard. This anti-sluggard is the thing that identifies behaviors that it sees must be changed. And this incessant judgment is difficult to satisfy. Now, it's a good voice to have, but on the road, it could seem, and it does feel, as though this is a somewhat of a slave driver with the whip behind me. The sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold. This is a good verse to ponder, that removal of oneself from responsibility. And perhaps there are constraints. There are natural constraints for which it does prevent our action. But the willful excuse of such things as the cold, which are quite variable. And when I say variable, I suppose I mean that they are not absolute. Cold is not an absolute contraindication to performing plowing duties. It is limiting, sure, but herein lies the dilemma. Is the limitation great enough so that in the future the man would accept his condition as a beggar in harvest? Now, I suppose it depends on the man. But in this example, it seems clear that the scales are tilted more towards plow despite the cold, so that he will have enough to eat when harvest comes. And what of these responsibilities? What of these weights that we take on? Surely man in his condition, just by virtue of his existence, has many responsibilities. The most immediate responsibility, perhaps not in terms of a totalizing responsibility, but as far as he is responsible for his own well-being, I think within him there is ingrained a certain selfish proclivity, a natural one, no doubt, to maintain that self, to maintain that individual identity. And that, in that sense, the selfishness is not necessarily corrupt. We can certainly imagine situations in which it may be. But man's first responsibility, in some sense, is to care for himself. Once he has sufficiently cared for himself, he can move outside of himself to include others. And certainly there are instances in which there ought to be, and there are, cases of self-sacrifice to preserve others to the detriment of the self. But what I want to discuss here is the nature of responsibility. As I've mentioned, it's a type of burden that we take on. Burden, perhaps, may be too strong of a word, in the sense that it implies the negative. Because a responsibility, although it may be taken out of necessity, is something that is a prerequisite for a healthy soul, a healthy mind. It is as if the human body, in absence of gravity, atrophied. The bones became weak, so the muscles withered away. The same, I think, could be said of the soul and the heavenly responsibilities that befall man are the obligation to himself, but also to those around him, to those conscious beings that are on a level plane, but also his responsibility for the material world that is before him, and all of the other interesting, fascinating creatures. He is the steward of the world that he finds himself in. And so, like this effect of gravity that we have to push against every day in order to participate in the world, it is something that is at one time limiting us, a force that we have to overcome, and yet it is something that we are adapted to, that we live with, that we have to accept. And if we did not, we would wither away. As we push against this gravity, we strengthen our muscles, we strengthen our bones. We think not much of moving against this force every day, but as limited as it may seem, it is something for us to overcome. We must have a reason to move against it. And as I've mentioned, the responsibilities of the heavenly dimension are those that have an effect like gravity on the body, but instead to the soul. There are many responsibilities that are inherent to our experience. Again, the one that I mentioned, the responsibility of the self to maintain one's livelihood, to continue existing, perhaps for he knows not what, but to take that responsibility, to accept the force and the burden, perhaps, that it entails. Now, some of these responsibilities, both in the sort of the physical domain and the spiritual domain that I've mentioned, are simple. They're fundamental responsibilities. Most people don't consider them too much. They take them on without hesitation. It is something that is ingrained within our culture. We are pre-programmed to accept certain responsibilities. And as we move out, as things become a little bit more obscure, there are types of responsibilities that have a particular intimate relationship to man's will, to the direction that he chooses to go in life. And these responsibilities, these choices, seem to be a little bit less implicit. They are more explicit. They ask of the mind better reasons. Loftier forces require more attention. More attention requires greater engagement. Perhaps that's an equivalency in terms, but as with many things in the Proverbs, we have found ourselves to one of the fundamental pillars of the human experience, and that is of attention and of its relationship, where it ought to be pointed, where his gaze should be directed, where he should be focusing. And of these responsibilities, I think there are circumstances and conditions for which a man can find himself in his life, such that he has set them up willfully. Some of them perhaps are, I want to say, contrary. Some of them are, I don't want to say antagonistic, unhealthy. Some of these responsibilities are the result of foolish behavior. Even in the case of man's flight, running away from his responsibilities, he in turn, because of his lack of prudence and his lack of foresight, fails to see the consequences and thereby the responsibilities that he places on himself in the future. This is of the negative sort. But of the positive sort, he may find himself at a crossroads in life to again imagine for himself something more, something greater. Or something simple for himself. And so there is, I suppose, of the selfish route, there is that of the positive and the negative. Of the first instance I mentioned, that of the negative. Surely there are lives that have been lived without, with a selfish view of the world, that have been successful, that have been fulfilling and purposeful. Not everyone born into existence has taken it upon themselves to have a family, to start a family, have children, nor perhaps should they. But since we are talking of responsibilities, I think the selfish path, while it is open to the self-sacrifice, it is also open to the temptation of wickedness and of foolishness, all of the evils that lie lurking within the enclosed self. It is as though, sort of reminds me of a time when I left some wet rags in the washing machine, and they gave off this terrible smell from bacterial growth. And if that washing machine, the door had been open, the rags would have dried out, the bacteria would have not propagated such as they had done. The same as with the self. If it is closed, it will become stagnant. It will begin to rot. A term that I think I coined this episode is auto-axialization. That is a form of self-divination. And in the instance, in the case that the man chooses his life for himself, I think there is a great risk for divinizing himself. Not just falling into the passions. He may be very compassionate for those that perhaps are outside of him, but that is only the case because himself is the totalizing reality. His imaginations of other people are just that. They are imaginations of the other people. Ultimately, those people are made within his mind, since he is the creator of that reality. A strange existence, it would seem, and at once it seems difficult to imagine such a situation, but I think we are all exposed to such delusions, increasingly so in the modern era, in the postmodern era. We find ourselves in communion with many of the transhumanists, which I think occupy this sort of self-actualization category. They wish to become gods themselves, to integrate with artificial intelligence in a selfish manner. Now I should remind myself that I'm discussing responsibility here. But all the same, this landscape is important, I think, to understanding where responsibility may find us. For I have yet to talk about the path of man that I think naturally guarantees the more sophisticated types of responsibility. And those more sophisticated types of responsibility are a recognition of something outside of the self, and that's difficult to do if one has chosen a life for the self. Even if they had chosen it for the self, there are instances, perhaps, where one may be awakened to that which lies beyond him. The other avenue I consider is that of having a family, of raising children. That, as I imagine, is the primary orienting structure of man. That is, it provides a natural environment for him to accept quite lofty sacrifices, learn lofty lessons. And this comes almost as implicit to him as it does waking up in the morning and getting out of bed against gravity. Something that he doesn't necessarily consider rationally or explicitly. And yet, it influences his behavior in such a way as though he had learned some quite valuable lessons of having gone through those experiences. Or as a man that gets up out of bed in the morning, he understands that when his legs slide off of the bed, he is not going to go upward, and he prepares himself for landing so that he doesn't collapse under the weight of his body. The same surely is true of the spiritual force that is thrust upon a person when he begins to raise a child. Now, of course, there are many people that are not competent on their feet. They have poor balance. And I think there are many people of poor spiritual integrity that do not understand the value of having a strong family relationship. And so I by no means am making the case that a family, although it is one of the primary modes by which man can learn, it is not always successful, primarily because of man's wickedness. But okay, so I've explored a few different things. I've stretched my fingers out into the darkness of my mind. I've tried to turn on some hanging lights. And so what can be said now of this responsibility, of the various different paths that man can take in his life, of all of the various different experiences that he might have, of the situations and the problems that may present themselves for which he must make a decision. A word that comes to mind that when I think of responsibility is accountability. It is duty. Now, to be accountable is somebody that takes an account of his actions. He pays attention to his actions, as if one action is better than another, and he justly weighs them against one another. In this way, he finds himself considering which actions are better than others, and he creates a sort of ladder in his mind, this value ladder, another vertical for which we can philosophize. Of this accountability, he is required or expected to justify his actions or decisions. Ultimately, this justification due to his experience in life and the ladder that is built over the years begins to establish some vector, I suppose we could say. That is, he is pointed in some direction. Now, this is a very limited example because I'm only talking about his own reflections and his own experience, his limited experience, nothing of his abstractions, nothing of his, well, experiences is quite a broad word, surely. But what I'm getting at here is that his judgments, although relative to other situations, ultimately points in that upward direction, that heavenly direction, for which the very understanding of which decision is better than another guides him. Now here comes to mind the situation of a family that just cannot work itself out. Perhaps it's an absent father, an absent mother, an abusive father, an abusive mother, whatever the case might be, in which there is a mind, an individual that doesn't really accept responsibility. And herein lies an interesting conception. For we consider those who fail at certain fundamental things like raising a family are said to not accept responsibility. And it's interesting because it is not as though we say that they are establishing a different hierarchy in terms of that value ladder. Most certainly they are, but we don't say that. And we don't say that because that hierarchy is wrong. And that's also not to say that the man in the previous example is right in establishing his experiences, his decisions, his judgments relative to the others. Surely there will be a missing rung or two in there. But upon this ladder, this is how we ascend. This is how we find ourselves purposeful beings. This is how we form strong communities, strong societies, peaceful societies, by accepting responsibility. And so it seems that we are approaching something that surely I, and if anybody's listening to this, probably understands where this is going. But the question is, what are we accepting when we are accepting responsibility? Well, within the word responsibility, I see the word response. Responsibility is of the old Latin verb respondere, which signifies to answer or to respond. And so such a strange thing to think of it in this way, to answer or to respond. And what we are accepting is a behavior. Okay, we are accepting a behavior. But we are responding to something, which means we are in relation to something. Just like honor, it exists within the relational realm, so too does responsibility. Ultimately, it may be between one person and another, but it is, in every instance, in relation to that thing at the top of the ladder. The thing for which allows the light for us to be able to determine what thing is capable of being judged above another. And it's no easy matter. I say it's no easy matter because seemingly the tradition that we have in the United States of separating the church from the state having the monopoly on establishing the law of the land, seems counterintuitive. But it's only counterintuitive if many hundreds and perhaps thousands of years were not utilized by the human mind to learn from their experiences, to establish certain fundamentals and understand principles of stability and of what is truly valuable. Now, of the law, surely there is more to say there, of its limits in terms of the governmental purview, but that is not the point of this responsibility rabbit hole. Again, we are responding to that divinity at the top of the mountain. We are listening to the call to be righteous, the call to be truthful, to seek out those judgments that are made with the good in mind. And again, establishing the good is a matter of, I think, cultural sophistication. Because returning to our verse, the sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold, therefore shall he beg and harvest and have nothing. This was his opinion of the good. The good was not to plow because of the reason of the cold. And yet, due to his lack of insight or foresight, or perhaps he understood quite well, the result was that he would be a beggar in harvest and have nothing. Now, whether this is something that this man did not learn or something that he learned after the fact, after struggling through that hardship the next year, perhaps he did not mind the cold as much because he understood what the alternative was. And so he made a reasonable and judicious proposition between two avenues. And he responded to the call. The call that he hears saying, "Tolerate the cold so that you will not be poor this coming harvest." But in the first instance, the call came from his desire to rest because of the hardship that was afforded by the cold. But it was a false call. It was a disruption of the heart. It was a selfish desire. He did not sacrifice. He did not sacrifice in such a way that the outcomes of the future corresponded to his flourishing. Counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. So this is quite the illustration. Counsel in the heart of man is like deep water. Where to start? This is it's always very exciting to paint upon the canvas that is directed by the proverb. Counsel in the heart. So let's imagine, if we close our eyes, let's imagine our heart, of all the feelings and desires, the anxieties, the fears, the loves, the excitements, the joys, the ups and the downs. We consider the somewhat autonomous nature of the heart, that where it is effective warning us against danger, even before the mind is able to recognize it, the rational mind, I should say, the discerning mind. In other instances, it is a great deceiver, a wanter of base and superficial things. It may deceive us into what is actually true. It may alter our perception. Within our heart we have, as I've said, a degree of autonomy. There's a little adjuster that lives inside of it that tempers us, that provides us with different weights. These different weights are afforded to different feelings, different desires. It opens some and closes others relative to the situation, the context, and belief of the individual. In this way, we see some relationship to that of what we might consider the more rational part of mind. And yet this illustration, counsel in the heart of man, Here, I think we see, along with the adjuster, perhaps the adjuster is downstream of the deliberations of this council. I think of many people that are within the heart. Exactly how this is experienced, I have yet to determine. But I think a council of elders, but my heart perhaps is not that wise at this moment, though I desire it to be. So let's say in the idyllic situation, we have a council of elders that lives within our heart. They deliberate on what the most appropriate feeling ought to be. We should get excited at this, fearful at that, incensed at this, joyful at that. And what can we say of deep water? What can we say of the deep in general? I think there are many symbols that we can draw, many potential interpretations, I should say, that can be drawn out of the adjective deep. And the same goes with water. Water, obviously a fluid. It is conforming and yet lacks a constitution that allows us to grasp it. It is something that subjects us to change. It has this renewal and destructive element to it, as with the flood or the raging of a river. The deep is something that is unknown. I think of Genesis. God is moving along the deep, separating that creation, instilling the seed of intelligibility into that which is unknown. And I think in the like manner, the counsel of the heart, as it takes after this divinity, after it takes after its father, its kin, it possesses the capacity to conform to that environment, to that heavenly environment, in which it takes the light, again, of understanding of conscious experience, and places it in a realm that seems void of it. But deep water, again, this potentially destructive force, but altogether destabilizing, a place that can be inhospitable to man, except if he takes it upon himself to adapt to the environment. And so I'm torn between two things here. The council, as it may deliberate, surely may make a mistake. I think of Thucydides when he relates the Athenian decision to represent or to defend the Corcyraeans in their war with the Corinthians. The Athenians at the time, they were in a confederacy with the Corinthians, and they decided to accept the plea on the part of the Corcyraeans because of some injustice that was done to them. But they perceiving an upcoming war with the Lacedaemonians, which would become the Peloponnesian War, they said that in order to maintain a solid coalition with a force in the region that possessed, next to theirs, a strong navy and an advantageous geographic position for their city, Corsica, they decided to move into a type of confederacy with the Crusaders. And obviously this created some antagonism between the two states against the Corinthians and the Athenians. And after that, a series of unfortunate events took place. There were some revolts up in the Macedonian and Thracian territory, and the propositioning of those northern states, northern cities, with that of the Peloponnesian territory, that of the Lacedaemonian territory. And we can see how the dominoes fall from there. And so this is an example, this is a pattern in history that represents the failure of counsel. One has to wonder if the Peloponnesian War could have been prevented at all. Thucydides' trap is steeped in the idea that a rising power against another will be confronted by this sort of an inherent antagonism that is spirited by jealousy and the desire to control and accept responsibilities that perhaps ought to be distributed in a more efficient and effective manner. Of course, this is negative. We can just as easily have a wise and prudent counsel. And this is where the tearing comes in, the myself being torn, because the verse is not all that definitive. Deep water is in some sense inhospitable to man. The environment is quite difficult to find peace. It's certainly a responsibility to undertake, to be able to handle deep water. Because on one hand we have the unintelligibility of the deep, but also we have the change, both of the destructive and the renewal aspects of water. And it brings to mind sort of an explorer's dilemma. And the dilemma has to do with responsibility, ironically. Responsibility, but also sacrifice, which I think is inherent to accepting responsibility, to responding to the appropriate call from that divine source. In order to be safe, in order for the council to make a wise decision, they must understand exactly where they should step in the deep. They need to keep their line of intelligibility contiguous with that of the deep. And they need to be able to handle the change and the sway that the water brings as they venture out into the unknown. Now this manner of speaking seems to be illustrative of a people and a culture that's going out in this exploration. Perhaps in our contemporary era, this is exploring outer space, going to Mars, going to the moon, whatever. But this can just as easily apply to a man as he builds his life. Not just as he's in that stage of building his life, but living his life, even if he's at the end of life. The counsel of the heart doesn't rest. There's always deep waters. The second half of this verse, I think, is beautiful because it seems to recognize the potential split that can occur here in a person trying to interpret the verse. But a man of understanding will draw it out. That by itself perhaps doesn't mean anything, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Well, what is it? What is he drawing out? If you have to understand something, it means you are confidently above that information that allows for successful perception and action and behavior. I think that if it's not complete, at least it provides some grasp of what it might mean to understand something as true. If one is able to act on something and by their action they have predictable results, it probably is fairly probable that a person has good insight for the position and their confidence, again, their uprightness, for which that information allows them to sustain that confident posture, to be able to act on it again. But a man of confident posturing, of perception of information in the world that allows rightful and predictable behavior, will draw out that which is, or that was, previously unknown to him. This is sort of a process, the explorer's process. And so it gives us a direction that says the counsel that suggests, just as we have supposed that the counsel in the heart of man may be deceived, it is like deep water, potentially inhospitable. So that brings us to what it is. Is he drawing the water out? Is he drawing the deep out? Well, I think in the first instance we can say that he's drawing the water out. He is providing a pillar of stability, or an ark, in the case of Noah, for which his intelligible world is preserved among the uncertainty of the new. In the other sense, he is drawing out the deep. For as he conquers the water, he has brought understanding and abundance to that which was previously unknown to him, to a land that was previously unknown to him. A new part of the map has been revealed. But a man of understanding will draw it out. And so I've narrowed this down a little bit more. But what is something final that can be said about it? A man of understanding will draw it out. Now we have to understand the fractal nature here. Because in the first instance we have an equivalence between the counsel in the heart of man and deep water. In the second instance, but a man of understanding will draw it out. I've made a comparison to the drawing of it out as that of the unintelligible or unknown factor of the deep, and of the conquering of the changing, fluid nature, of providing stability to that chaos. And so this applies as much to the civilizational exploration as it does to the heart of man. And in the case of the heart of man, what is being drawn out, I think, is the integration of one's desire, of one's feelings. It is the recognition of where they are placed, of when they are experienced, why they are experienced. And just as Noah and his experience with the ark, maintaining, preserving, we, like Noah, embark on the seas of the heart, reach down into its depths to find something that we didn't perhaps know was there. We have opened up an experience, potential experience, for which the heart can rage forth like a river. Again, the counsel is there to determine on the way to go. We instruct that little adjuster to handle the various weights, much like a dam that blocks a river. And so again, it is the unintelligible being brought or drawn out of itself into the intelligible, into the illuminated sphere. And it is the successful navigation of change and of the ending of death and of the renewal of birth. And so I think that this is where I'm going to end part 1 of chapter 20. I finished with verse 5 there. I'll continue with verse 6 next time.